we get everybody to get in a seat, we need to get going. The time's here. Please stop your discussions if you would. All talking, please stop. All right, we really need to get some quiet here so we can get going and get started on time. Though I guess this is the first time in a while we don't have another committee coming in to push us out, so I guess we can meet all afternoon maybe, I don't know. We're going to call on Senator Hickman to do our invocation for us, if you would, please.
Yeah, let us pray, please. Gracious Heavenly Father, thank you for this day, Lord, and thank you that you have honored us with your presence today, Lord. We know that where two or more are gathered, you're in the presence, Lord, and we feel your presence. We ask you for wisdom and justice and moderation and courage, Heavenly Father, as we deliberate today on the tax credits. Lord, we love you and praise you. In your Son's name we pray. Amen.
Amen. All right, thank you for that. We appreciate everybody being here today. This is the I guess close that door. I guess that's where all the noise is coming from. Thank you. So we do appreciate everybody being here today. This meeting today is going to be more of an educational meeting. We invited the full committees from Finance and Ways and Means for that, as well as obviously the 6 members each has on the study committee. This is similar but not exact to what was done 12 years ago, where we had a group that went through looking at how to position Georgia best for the future. That's the aim here, is what can we do to maximize the return to Georgia and have investments that are good for us. We had a study committee that Vice Chairman of Finance, Senator Albers, did a few years ago, and I remember Pew Charitable Trust saying that there were 3 buckets of states: those that do a really good job at going back and analyzing them, those that do a fair job, and those that do a poor job. They had us in the poor job category. So we've tried to make some changes to in the House and the Senate, such as Senate Bill 6 that we study 5 of them each year, auditing of the films now, and trying to get a little bit better business approach on looking at these from independent studies, and you'll hear from some departments on that. So today is really just sort of tax credit 101, where we try to make sure we know everybody's role. We're trying to educate everybody in the role of the departments and what we're doing. So with that, I'll turn it over to my co-chair here, Chairman Shaw Blackman. For we can. Our members on the committee is myself, Vice Chairman Albers, our Appropriations Chair Blake Tillery, Chairman Calzert of Regulated Industries, Transportation Chair Greg Dolezal, and Senator Michael Rhett as well on our side. So if you want to introduce your committee.
Well, thank you, Chairman, and add my welcome to everyone here this afternoon. Nothing like a good talk about taxes right after lunch. Put everybody to sleep. Our members, I think all but one are here with us today on the joint review panel. Chairman Martin to my left. Chairman Williamson is not here. Chairman Carpenter, if you raise your hand. Representative Buckner is here, I believe. And Chairman Matt Hatchett. Thank you all for being here, and thank you to the whole Ways and Means Committee, as well as all the other people that are with us this afternoon. I don't have a whole lot to add. We've got a really robust number of presenters this afternoon, so I know we want to jump right to it. I just would add one small thing to reiterate that we wanted to introduce everybody to this tax review panel and get a little education and an introductory meeting so that we're all kind of looking at this from a similar viewpoint. And I know we've got a lot of folks that are going to help move us in that direction today. But Again, I guess without further ado, unless you have anything else, Chairman Huffstedler, we'll get started with somebody who's been just an absolute treasure for the state of Georgia. That's Dr. Jeffrey Dorfman with the University of Georgia, our state economist. While you're making your way up there, Dr. Dorfman, I would just mention each of our presenters today have left a minute or two at the end for questions. If you have a burning question and you need to ask it, please do so, but we do have a pretty full agenda, and so we want to try to move through it in an expeditious fashion if possible. If you have public comments as we proceed through this process, we're looking at other meetings down the road that will begin once a month, I think starting in August, Chairman, and we'll have some opportunities for that, but we will also have an email address if you want to submit public comment or special comment that you can do so there. Sorry, Dr. Dorfman, the floor is yours, sir.
I actually appreciate the honor today of actually getting to sit in one of your seats rather than usually I just sit in the back until it's my turn to speak. So that was a nice honor this afternoon. As Chairman Huffstedler said, this is sort of tax credits 101, and I'm going to stick to sort of the very basic economic principles of tax credits and not speak to any particular programs or policy points. The economic reality of tax credits is that when we help to expand an industry that isn't profitable without our help, that's bad for the economy. Generally, that's not what you want to do. Thus, tax credits only make sense for business attraction if attracting that plant or employer or industry to the state is going to bring you some spillover benefit, some long-term benefit, or some non-economic benefit. Okay? So in other words, you're doing something that you know is a loss when you award the tax credit. You have to have in mind some other goal that is going to be the gain in order for that to make sense. Keeping this in mind, tax credits should be used sparingly and for targeted opportunities only. Once a key industry is attracted, you don't want to subsidize suppliers or follow-on investments, right? You took the loss up front, now you need to get those gains later. And as new industries mature, you should be seeking to end or shrink their tax credits. Because again, to get those long-term benefits. These are sort of the basic economic principles of tax credits. They're agreed to by every economist who studies business attraction, incentives, and economic developments. If anybody's interested, an economist named Tim Bartik wrote an entire book on exactly this called Making Sense of Incentives, Taming Business Incentives to Promote Prosperity. So this is sort of generally agreed upon. And again, the idea is carefully targeted, sparingly, when you see some other reason, some way you're going to get that money back and win in the long run. And really, that's my statement as a state economist. I'm happy to take questions or sit down and wait till the end.
Anybody have questions for Dr. Dorfman? Who is that? 35. Representative Fry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the presentation, Dr. Dorfman. Would you say that the tax credits that you're talking about that need to phase out would be more focused on brick and mortar and actual physical investments into the community that they're operating in, as opposed to something that doesn't necessarily have like an office or a manufacturing facility within the state?
What's an example of the second type?
I guess it would be like instead of a Rivian, a film tax credit. Like Rivian is coming in.
Sure. So, okay, thank you for the question. I think I can sort of point to both. A Rivian is an example of a big new industry that you can bring in where the long-term benefit is all the suppliers and the follow-on investments that you're going to get. So it could theoretically, I'm not talking about any specific thing, but theoretically a Rivian could make sense because of all the other stuff that's going to follow it. The goal would be not to give tax credits to the follow-on stuff then. Film tax credits, I think, would fall more in the bucket of it was a new industry when we started the film tax credit program. Now the Georgia film industry is a mature industry. And so now I would think that the legislature would be sort of claiming victory on creating this great industry and looking to shrink or end those credits.
Senator Gooch.
Dr. Dorfman, thank you for being here today. Considering Georgia's anti-gratuities clause in the Constitution, other states around us and probably nowhere in the country have that, how would we be competitive if we didn't offer tax credits?
So Dr. Bushman may talk more about this, but the general research that's been done shows that usually 80 to 95% of the businesses that come to your state with attraction incentives, tax credits or otherwise, we're going to locate in your state anyway. So if we offered no tax credits or any business attraction incentives at all, we would lose a small amount of new business investment, but we would still get most of what we're getting. And remember, when your unemployment rate is 2 or 3%, exactly who's going to fill these jobs, right? Our economy is so strong in the employment sense right now, and we have done such a good job already of establishing our position. I would point you to when Amazon was looking to establish their HQ2, a second headquarters, and basically asked the entire country to offer them as much money as possible to see who would get it. Austin, Texas said, we want you to come here, our offer is 0. San Jose, California said the same thing. So you can probably not take that position at the start, but once you have built a position of leadership, I think you can, if not eliminate, certainly reduce the incentives that you provide to businesses. And that doesn't mean you were wrong before. It may mean that the strategy you had before worked, but you need to update it now to reflect the advantages you gained from what you were doing before.
I believe Senator Albers, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Dorfman, one of my concerns is the outstanding liabilities to the state. With outstanding credits that are heavily into the billions of dollars, should we have an uncertain economic year or two, that could potentially tip the state's budget upside down. Do you have any perspective on that?
Yes, and thank you for that question. So I have been state economist for 4 years, and for the entire 4 years, the director of OPB and I have been worried about that exact thing. The outstanding tax credits are roughly equal in size to our RSR. So we could have our reserves completely wiped out if businesses suddenly decided to turn them all in. And it definitely is worse. In fact, one thing that could be considered is offering some sort of program where we try and encourage people to turn them in now while we have strong reserves.
And I guess follow-up question for that is, we talk about our rainy day fund or the RSR, but really we use that as cash flow for the state too. So it's not as if all that money is technically in the bank at any given time. So again, my concern is maybe it's even larger than we could think of if someone were to cash those in, because money's coming in and out of the state constantly. So it doesn't always mean those dollars are necessarily in the bank. Is that not accurate?
Money is coming in and out of the state all the time. you are correct that there could be situations where the RSR has a notional figure on paper and we actually have less. It's not where we are now. Now we have considerably more in the bank. So that won't happen probably for a while. But true.
We hope so. Thank you.
Yes.
I've got two blinking right now. Trying to think, who is that? Is that Representative Ridley? Okay.
My notes don't-
Then Chairman Tillery.
I don't know. It's okay.
Thank you. I guess the question I have, are we not at a position right now to where we have several 100,000 jobs available more than we do actual people working? Is that not what I read the other day in an
Wait.
article?
We have, I don't know the figure for Georgia. Nationwide, we have about 1.8 or 1.9 job openings for every unemployed person.
Okay, well, in Georgia, I think I seen an article the other day that said we had something like 100,000 more jobs open than we do actual people that's working. So in that aspect, if that's true, I mean, the tax credits have worked so far, but now's the time to start pacing those off if you've got more jobs than you do people. Is that not correct?
It is certainly correct that you would think with record low unemployment, all-time high employment in the state of Georgia, that we don't need to work that hard to bring more jobs here, because we're just gonna, those new businesses are gonna steal workers from the existing businesses.
Right. Thank you very much.
Chairman Tillery.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Dorfman, first of all, thank you for your help over the past 4 years, and we are going to be remiss to lose you to the state of North Carolina. Thank you for your service to Georgia and everything you've done to help us weather through what, people get tired of this word, has been a crazy, unprecedented time for ups and downs. So thank you, first of all. And I think the members agree with me on that. I've always appreciated how concise you are and precise. So I wrote down exactly what you said. You said carefully targeted and sparingly. Taking into account for a moment, I know Leader Gooch's comments about the gratuities clause and why that makes Georgia somewhat separate. Mm-hmm. How do we compare to other states as far as the number of tax credits? That's not something I've ever seen, and I wondered if you have any knowledge of.
Number, you mean like the different programs?
Yes, sir. Do other states have more or less, about the same, or do you have any knowledge of that?
Boy, off the top of my head, I don't know that I can give you a good answer. Yeah, I haven't counted up programs in different states. I think we are considered probably somewhat above average in total tax credits offered, but a lot of that's confusing because we're also the 8th biggest state, right? So our dollar figures are naturally going to be bigger than all the smaller states. So I think it would be hard to do a good comparison.
All right, so we've got two more questions, and then we're going to move to the next presenter. Senator Rhett, did you have a question?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just had one thought. I was wondering, during the pandemic, did we extend these tax credits, and were we able to make it through the tough times with those tax credits in place?
That's a great question. We made it through the pandemic without a big run on tax credits, I think probably because of the PPP program, the other COVID relief programs, the fact that the period where we were worried about state finances and businesses were worried about the business finances was pretty short, right? We were one of the first states to reopen. So I think there were definitely some months where we were very scared that all those tax credits were going to roll in right when we were, potentially going to run out of money. But it happened so fast, and we got through that so quickly that it never really materialized. So there wasn't a big acceleration of tax credit use during the pandemic.
Chairman Martin.
Thank you, Dr. Dorfman. Real briefly, and I'll ask this, the question about the credits that are outstanding versus the revenue shortfall reserve. Isn't it true when the governor prepares the budget every year, there's an assumption made that an amount of that revenue will be paid, the anticipated tax revenue will come in credits? Isn't it true that that's taken into consideration in terms of a cash versus an accrual accounting process?
So in the governor's revenue estimate, there is an assumption that a certain number of tax credits will be utilized each year, right? They're generated, and a lot of them you can turn in up to 5 years later. So we predict how many we think are going to come in each year. And so, yeah, that's essentially it's revenue we never get, right? Because it's not like they pay us the money and then take it back in a credit. They turn in the credit with their return instead of cash. But yes, we make a prediction of that, and it's built into the governor's revenue estimate.
Just to follow up with that, certainly there are those numbers out there that we're concerned about, as Senator Albert said. I just wanted to, for our friends in the media, I just wanted to make them aware that the governor's office and OPB does take into consideration that these things are coming in, and we're not sitting on a ticking financial time bomb, if we will.
No.
All right, I know we have a few more questions out there. We do need to move along. Chairman Hickman, you got a quick question? We'll wrap it up with you, sir.
Yes, it's just a very quick question. You kind of hit on it, but how many tax credits do not have caps, and which ones are they? And then how much is all the tax credits possible added together, the caps?
Well, I don't know what the total would be of capped ones. I think all the big ones are uncapped. All the capped are on little ones, but Dr. Bushman may be able to give you a better answer than I can, but I mean, job tax credits aren't capped. Film tax credit isn't capped. The R&D tax credit's not capped. So I think generally we've only capped the little ones.
Okay.
Sure.
I got one more.
Chairman's privilege.
Chairman's privilege here.
Yes, sir.
Following up on Chairman Martin's question, we account for it, but there's a lot of stuff that's not there. Is there any advantage, and do other states put the revenue up here and then deduct from there so that everybody sees in the budget process where the money's going? In other words, they might look and say, well, we're doing this, but I would rather do that. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yes. So we do that too. If you know where to look in the appendix to the budget, we append a report from Georgia State's Fiscal Research Center that shows the annual tax expenditures of the state, which includes tax credits, all the ways that taxes are not coming in because of things the legislature have passed. So you may not see it in the main part of the budget, but it is there if anybody wants to dig for it. Some states make that information a little more prominent, and some make it a little less prominent.
Dr. Dorfman, I want to just add my thanks to your service to this state and appreciate all that you have done. And personally, I have enjoyed really working with you on a number of things. So thank you for being here today.
Thank you for that, and for Senator Tillery trying to point it out and potentially embarrass me in front of the
Godspeed to you, Doc.
Thank you.
Another one of our trusted economists is next. Call, if you will, Dr. Robert Bushman, Director of Fiscal Research at Georgia State University. He takes a look at a lot of our fiscal notes. Is that fair to say, Doc?
Yeah, most of them.
Very-
Revenue side, anyway.
Very good to have you today. I'll turn the floor over to you.
Okay, I do not have a long presentation. It's only actually 3 slides, counting this one, so it's mostly an outline. I'm going to go a little bit longer than Dr. Dorfman did. Again, I'm Bob Bushman. I run the Fiscal Research Center at Georgia State University. Fiscal Research Center, as many of you know, is focused mostly on tax policy work for the state. We prepare revenue related fiscal notes. Any tax bill that's working its way through the legislature, we'll take a look at and score it. We produced the state's tax expenditure report that Dr. Dorfman just mentioned. It does not have totals, by the way, so you'd have to manually add that up. Maybe that's something we should add, but we can talk about that. And starting in late 2021, we began evaluating tax incentives under the framework of Senate Bill 6 that was enacted earlier that year. So I'm going to give you a bit of an overview on how we do that and the rationale behind some of the things that you'll find in those reports. As you know, SB 6 provided for the evaluation of up to 10 tax incentive programs per year. I use the term tax incentive program a bit loosely. Provisions evaluated aren't strictly limited to programs intended to incentivize particular economic choices like job creation or investment in the state to grow the economy. The state's larger tax expenditures include things like sales tax exemptions for prescription drugs and groceries to make those necessities more affordable and the sales tax itself less regressive. Even narrowing the scope down to tax credits, which is part of the name of this committee, many are intended to incentivize or subsidize choices other than purely economic goals, including social goals like encouraging organ donation or adoption of foster kids. The framework for evaluations under SB 6, though, is designed mostly around business incentives, where the goal is economic growth, ultimately more jobs and greater incomes for Georgians, providing a return to taxpayers for those subsidies that they're handing out. So the framework requires us to weigh benefits in terms of economic and fiscal gains arising from the incentive against the fiscal costs, the tax expenditures and the administrative costs of the program. The law also calls for us to consider other public benefits, effects that may be less obvious and perhaps harder to measure. For example, low-income housing credit can be evaluated in terms of the jobs and state GDP associated with the construction and operation of the housing that the credit helps to fund. And the tax revenues arising from that activity may or may not offset the cost of the credits. But better housing conditions for low-income families can have other public benefits as well, including reduced crime and better health and educational outcomes for low-income people. Other tax incentives may be targeted to investments in pollution control. You're not looking at state GDP there or the number of jobs created. You're looking for better air quality or water quality. We also have incentives for private funding of hospitals or education or cultural amenities. The public benefits of those things are not easily measured in GDP or employment. Each report discusses those other public benefits that are relevant to the particular tax preference. Now, the net change in revenue is simply the foregone state revenues from the particular tax preference, less any revenue gains from increased economic activity that's due to that incentive. We can usually measure foregone revenue directly from the tax data, especially in the case of income tax preferences where we have the utilization of tax credits and deductions and other things, or from other economic data, especially in the case of sales or other taxes. The potential offsetting revenue gains depend on the economic activity that is attributable to the policy, including the ripple effects from the initial incentivized activity. The difficult question in tax incentive evaluations is, what is the economic impact of the behavior you're rewarding or subsidizing with the tax incentive? It's a hard question, not because the calculations are hard, we have software to help us with that, but because it's hard to know whether the behavior you're subsidizing occurred because of the tax incentive or would have occurred anyway. Many economic impact analyses implicitly assume that causal connection. They calculate the direct, indirect, and induced economic activity associated with all of the credit earning activity and report it as if all the activity was attributable to the policy, as if none of it would have occurred without the policy. Many of you, I believe, are business people, and you know that decisions to invest in new projects and people depend on expected returns on those investments over and above the cost of capital. You invest in profitable projects and pass on unprofitable ones. When a tax incentive makes an otherwise unprofitable investment profitable, it's fair to say the project would not have gone forward without the tax incentive. On the other hand, otherwise profitable projects that also earn the tax incentive shouldn't be attributed in a causal sense if the investment would have been made without the incentive. The question of causality can't be answered reliably by simply asking the beneficiary of the tax incentive if their choice would have been different without it. The incentive is valuable, so that reality would tend to bias the answers. But with sufficient data, we can try to empirically test whether the policy had an observable impact on the choices of firms or individuals whose behavior the policy is meant to affect. That's the preferred approach and the one taken for some of the evaluations that have been done to date, in particular the low-income housing and historical rehabilitation tax credits. Unfortunately, that's not always possible. The data just isn't adequate, or the incentive is too new. We don't have the data yet. In other cases, we have to rely on studies in the economic literature on similar policies in other states. But with the but-for question answered as well as the data allow, we then estimate the overall economic activity arising from the incentivized behavior. Using a software model called IMPLAN, we estimate the economic activity that arises in a sort of ripple effect from the initial or direct economic activity, which might be building an apartment complex or a data center or buying equipment, or the boost in production that you get from hiring more workers. The point I want to emphasize is that all of the downstream effects of this new direct activity, the ripple or multiplier effects, are in the estimated economic impacts in our reports. You'll see them in the tables. These estimates, in turn, enable us to estimate any revenue gains that may offset some or all of the cost of the incentive. Now, what's not in an IMPLAN or similar analysis is the opportunity cost of the state spending through the tax code to subsidize economic choices. The opportunity cost of anything is what you have to give up to get it. Not the money cost of it, not the price of it, but what else you could have done with that money. Because of the state's balanced budget requirement, when you create any tax incentive program, you are directly reducing revenues and must offset the tax expenditure by either reducing some other expenditures or raising taxes on someone else. Creating the incentive is a choice with an opportunity cost, the benefits otherwise received from using the funds for something else. This is where the alternate use of funds analysis comes in. You'll see that in our reports. Now, we don't want to presume what your budget priorities are or should be, particular types of spending or which taxes you might want to cut. Each of the myriad of options would have different effects, some shorter term, some longer. So we don't presume a choice, and we're certainly not making any kind of argument for maximizing government revenues as an objective, as was suggested by some critics of the evaluations. We're simply saying that unless you actually raised other taxes to pay for a tax incentive, you necessarily cut spending to pay for it. So having no way of knowing whether the funds would have otherwise gone to education or transportation or health or courts, we assume the alternate use of $1 of tax expenditures is $1 of general fund spending. At the time of last year's evaluations, that meant roughly 57 cents going to education, 22 to health, 8 to public safety, et cetera, based on general fund appropriations in recent years. We don't say that's what should be done, but we apply the same methods of estimating the economic and fiscal impacts of that alternate use of funds as we do for the direct spending attributable to the tax incentive. We then compare the net change in economic activity and revenues from the tax incentive to those from the alternate use, just as you might compare the expected returns from alternate investment opportunities in your business. When the goal or expected benefit of the incentive is its economic and fiscal return to taxpayers, this comparison is very important. Of course, the importance of other public benefits or as goals of some incentives means that this comparison isn't a final answer, just information to help you judge the program. So that's what I've got. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Chairman Elvers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Bush, first, thank you for all the work we have done over the years on analyzing this work. You and your team have been instrumental to the work that we do in the state. I just want to make sure that everybody understood your fourth bullet point here about the direct, indirect, induced economic activity, often called the halo effect by many of us, that is truly being captured in the total of 10 audits we are completing per year. I want to make sure everybody hears that you all are capturing that, and maybe a little bit of how you do that.
Well, the Implan software, it's an input-output model. I'm sure Dr. Dorfman's familiar with it. Some of you may be, particularly if you're in the economic development field. It's pretty standard. It uses data on the Georgia economy, the inputs to different industries, the outputs to those industries, the people working in those industries, and calculates so the direct effect is that initial investment. If you're building a data center, it's the investment in the data center. The indirect effects are suppliers. I'm simplifying a little bit, but the induced effects are all the workers whose jobs are created either directly in that new data center or in all the suppliers spending their income in the economy. You hear economists talking about stimulus plans at the federal level and multiplier effects. That's what we're talking about. All the trickle down, well, I hate that term, the ripple effects through the economy from some kind of spending, whether it's a business investment or a government expenditure. It ripples through the economy, and people spend that money over and over again in their local economy. Some of it flows out of state, but not most of it.
And thank you. I just want to clarify that for our study committee, our combined committees, as well as everyone who has a vested interest in the process, that is, in fact, being measured in all the audits we do today. So thank you for your comments.
Is Representative Buckner?
I'm not sure I understood what you said. So many of the tax credits that I'm familiar with require the expenditure by the individual that is seeking the tax credit up front. So essentially the state is not on the hook for anything until that development or that project or those jobs are provided. So when you talked about an offset requiring tax funds for tax credits, that's after the state's already received some value from that development. Is that not true?
I apologize if I wasn't clear before, but if I understand your question, let me just go through an example. Take the low-income housing tax credit. It takes usually up to 3 years or so for a new low-income housing project to actually be completed and the developer to start earning credits. But the construction activity is the initial investment that's being made. It employs a lot of people, generates ripple effects through the economy as those people and the suppliers spend their money elsewhere. That activity and just the operation of a low income, of any apartment complex, has ongoing positive economic impacts. It's providing housing services, it's employing people. So all of those activities generate tax revenues. So those tax revenues can offset some or possibly, conceivably all of the tax expenditure that you're making by giving out the credits.
Well, to follow up, I know there are at least a few of the tax credits that I'm aware of. The state generally makes more money. For every dollar they invest, they may receive $4 or $5 back. So it's not really fair to say that we have to offset it up front we have to just pay the tax credit at the end.
Oh,
And we've made money off of that. There's a ratio. Is that not true?
You mean it during the budgeting process when you're deciding whether to adopt some new tax incentive? Is that what you're asking?
I was trying to figure out what you meant by offset and having tax funds for the tax credit, and that we were liable for that and might have to raise funds for tax credit.
Okay, maybe I guess I misunderstood your question before. So if you're talking about enacting a new tax incentive, you're looking at a budget. It's presumably balanced. It's supposed to be. You decide, well, here's an idea for a new tax incentive that'll help the Georgia economy. The budget's already balanced. You don't have more revenue coming in this year than what's in the budget. You can't, sorry. So to keep that budget balanced, you have to move something else. Something else has to change. Was that your question? So you either have to, okay, I'm just not understanding. That's my fault. I'm sorry.
Can we get, that maybe circled up? Yeah, thank you, Representative Buckner. I do have one quick question. Sounds like you do too, maybe perhaps, but see if I can word this correctly. When we're talking about whether or not jobs would have maybe located here or, or not otherwise, do we have data that would show us what maybe the competitive offer was in another state? Or do we bump that up against those kinds of things? Or is this just an assumption based on some of the factors that you've mentioned?
You mean for like a large project that's negotiating for tax incentives?
Well, when we're looking at incentives and whether or not there would have been, those jobs would have come to, our state otherwise, do we have that kind of component to be able to bounce it against? Probably not, but I didn't know.
Yeah, we do. Like I said before, it's not always possible to empirically test, but there may be similar policies in other states where you can look at analyses there that do get at that but-for question, the causality. But where we can, we do that analysis ourselves.
Gotcha.
Maybe I'm not answering the question. I don't know.
Well, I mean, obviously, when we're, competing for jobs in a competitive region like we're in, I mean, do we know what the other states are bringing to the table when those are decisions, or what they're being made over?
Not really. I mean, on large projects like on Amazon or Rivian, I'm sure someone has an idea of what other states are offering. We look at whether other states offer similar credits if we're evaluating a particular credit.
Some have other incentives that they can offer, like, we offer Quick Start. They may have, not have a gratuities clause. Just curious. I'll let us move on, Doc. I know you had a question, Chairman, so.
Thank you, Dr. Bushman. I have two questions that are sort of related. One, are there other models for the but-for causation? Because even I, who generally have a lot of questions about tax credits, don't necessarily always agree with the but-for causation final analysis, even though it cuts against my philosophical view usually on tax credits.
Well, I mean, there's room for differences depending on the margin. Our estimates are our estimates. They're based on what data is available to us. With the low-income housing tax credit, I think I estimated that about a quarter of the projects could fairly be attributed to the state tax credit. There are so many other tax incentives available to low-income housing tax credits that we don't think the state credit in particular tips the scales on very many of them. But we estimated about a quarter. Other people may get different estimates using different data.
So on that same topic, now going the other side, back maybe where I feel more comfortable sometimes. When you do this analysis as well, you're looking at other things that may also be abated. Am I correct? Does that fall into your analysis? So for instance, if you're saying a producer coming to this community is going to bring X number of jobs, and that's going to create a multiplier effect in property taxes, et cetera. Does that take into account that another layer of government, maybe the local government's going to also abate the property taxes, and then they're going to get job tax credits on the jobs that were used to build it? Do all those stackings take into account in your analysis? Are those taken into account in your analysis?
We do account for the revenues that would be earned from that downstream economic activity, whether it's property taxes at the local level or sales taxes at local and state levels. We don't have any information on whether a particular credit earning project also got an abatement, for example. We don't really know that. It's just not information that's generally available to us.
Which would make the number worse then.
Well, obviously, you're not getting some of the local revenue that we attribute to it. Yeah.
Just one comment on both of these economic professors. You know, we started income tax in the 1930s. I believe the only 2 rate cuts were in the last 5 years, and I know Dr. Bushman ran I don't know how many Excel spreadsheets trying to make sure we treated everybody fairly. We had Dr. Dorfman in the middle of it, and so the structure of these tax cuts and trying to make sure that everyone was taken care of, and even, you know, at the low income level as well, is because of their work. And I really appreciate your work on those tax cuts we were able to do.
I would ditto those comments, Chairman. Go ahead.
One other comment is he was emailing it to the committee at 3 a.m. and I was replying back to him.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bushman. Pleasure having you. Is the Department of Audits here? Are they ready to go? Matt? All right, Mr. Taylor? Thank you for being here. Floor is yours.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for having me. I'm going to start with, can you hear me? A closer. Okay. Well, I have bad news and good news. My presentation is significantly longer than the last 2, but the good news is they've covered about half of it already, so I will go through it quickly. So the first thing I wanted to note is the Department of Audits is a legislative agency, for those that may not know. We provide objective, independent information to decision makers, that's legislators and executive branch staff. We appreciate the trust that everyone puts in us. I'm going to cover these things today very quickly. I'll talk about some of the tax-related products that Department of Audits manages or produces, some detail about what's in the tax incentive report, or tax expenditure report, I'm sorry, and then some items we want to consider. So this slide is examples of some of the audits that we have done on tax incentives. We've looked at these in some form or fashion for decades, even before the work noted here. Years ago, we did an inventory of all the economic development programs, which included tax incentives. The next year, we looked at administration of corporate income tax, and in that report, we recommended routine evaluations of tax credits and a tax expenditure report to be created. More recently, we've reviewed various tax exemptions and credits. Some of those focused on the administration, like agricultural tax exemption, rural hospital tax credit, which is an ongoing review we've been asked to do each year. Others looked at the impact, the economic impact of the incentive and fiscal impact, like film, GARJA, the education or SSO credit. And some of these, the rural hospital, GARJA, and the SSO credit, those were all directed by the General Assembly. So the tax expenditure report, this was recommended in an earlier performance audit. This legislation was passed in 2010. The first report was created in January of 11. As was mentioned earlier, Georgia State University creates that under contract with the department. It is quite comprehensive. It includes all credits, exemptions, deductions, anything that could be considered a tax expenditure, personal, corporate, premium taxes, sales tax are all included in there. It has a 3-year estimate for each provision. It's the current year that when it's delivered, it's the next budget year, and then the following year. I believe is that correct? One item to note in there is for the tax credits, the report shows the amount expected to be claimed in a given year. It's not the amount that is earned or generated in that year. So sometimes you'll hear about the amount generated, and it's a bigger number than what you might see in that tax expenditure report, because what's earned in a year may be claimed over 3 to 5 years. Let's see. The next thing we work on are fiscal notes. We get anywhere from 50 to 60 one year to over 100 the next year. A little less than half of those are tax related. If it's related to agency spending, the department analyst, we work with agencies and OPB to identify the cost. For tax-related legislation, what we do is we try to ensure that the legislation is being correctly interpreted. We track down additional information if it's needed. Then we review the analysis that's been produced by either Georgia State University or UGA's Department of Agricultural and Applied Economics, and then we draft the fiscal note. OPB, they review the note. They may have suggestions prior to the signature by the OPB director, and then it's signed by the state auditor. So my next few slides are about the tax incentive evaluations that Dr. Bushman spent a fair amount of time discussing, so I'll go through these as quickly as I can. This Senate Bill 6 passed in 2021. We get actually 10 requests a year, five from each chamber. We were required to contract for this work. We issued an RFP. We received just 3 responses. All of them were from USG institutions. We deemed each of them qualified to do the work, and so we contracted with each. And that's Georgia Southern University, their Center for Business Analytics and Economic Research, Georgia State's Fiscal Research Center, and then the University of Georgia's Carl Vinson Institute of Government. What we do in the department, we review the request, we assign to the contractors after we've ensured that they are independent. They've attested to their independence on the topic, and we have defined in the contract what we mean by independence. We provide a general outline that the report should follow. We may review research plans, we review the drafts, and then we create summaries for the General Assembly and the public. So an important point about these reviews is they are intended to be independent. That was very clear in the legislation. That was clear in our RFP process, in our contracting. We didn't want researchers that had any that financially benefited in any way from the incentive, or even have been paid by supporters or detractors of an incentive in the past. So we've even had existing contractors that are not independent for some of the requests. So we make sure we assign it to a different contractor. And so the 4 components that Dr. Bushman discussed, this is the economic activity. This is gray box. Well, I don't know if it's gray there, but this is from one of our summaries produced last year. The measures typically that are reported are jobs, the labor income, value added, and economic output. And as Dr. Bushman said, these always include the total impact, the direct, indirect, and induced, or the ripple effect. And an important step in this analysis, as Dr. Bushman discussed, is the but-for analysis, the determining what portion of the activity was resulting only from the credit or the incentive. So
Could I get you, Matt, to
Sure.
maybe for some of the members on that last slide, go over those 4 boxes, because I think some people don't understand what they mean. If you could go through those.
Yes.
Or are you doing that later on?
I can go over those.
Okay.
So the jobs are, as Dr. Bushman said, these are the jobs that were created by the company that receives the benefit, by the suppliers to those companies, and then jobs related to the spending by the employees of the benefiting companies and their suppliers. And then the same would be true for the labor income, which is largely employee income, but I believe also producer income. Is that right? But it's largely employer, the amount paid to the employers. The economic, well, then the labor, the value added versus economic output. Economic output double counts some of the activity among the firms and the suppliers, where the value added is the measure that the economists typically use. It's the state GDP. It is the contribution to the state GDP. That answer the question? Okay. And the numbers that we include in these summaries are after the but-for analysis. So this is not the number that comes right out of M-Plan. This is the number after a percentage has been applied, the percentage that is attributable to the incentive itself. So the second component is the change in state revenue. And as was noted earlier, this begins with the foregone state revenue, then the economic activity that's attributed to the incentive, any revenue generated from that, and that may or may not offset the foregone revenue. And for state government, this is primarily income and sales tax, while for local government, this is often sales tax and can be property tax as well. So the third component is net cost. This is generally administrative cost of the agencies that that administer the incentive, like the Department of Revenue or the Department of Community Affairs. One item that I would note with the cost in these reviews is while the proper administration of any incentive is vital to them working as intended, the administrative costs are unlikely to be a significant factor when you determine if an incentive is worthwhile. In relation to the cost of the incentive, they tend to be very small. It is possible for an incentive, for some provisions that may reduce state spending in other areas, so we may have net costs that change that are unrelated to administration. And so the example is a report that we'll have coming out pretty soon, that is the Qualified Education Expense Credit, or the SSO credit, where any student that is deemed to have moved from a public school to a private school as a result would reduce QBE spending by that amount. So that would be a reduction in cost. That is not administrative. It's not administering the credit itself. The last component is the public benefit. This is a larger discussion for the provisions that do not have an economic development purpose. So this would be like the grocery store sales tax, the prescription sales tax exemptions. This is a smaller component when it's an economic development incentive. This is a list of the tax incentive evaluations that were released in 2022 on the left, or released in early 23. They were from the 22 request list. And then on the right, the requested projects for this year. These reports should be released by December 1st. And at the bottom of the slide, we have that's a link to a web page on the department website that includes a list of all of the reports that have been released, some of the older reports that were done by the Department of Audits prior to the SB 6 passage. And then we have some frequently asked questions and some common terms that you may find helpful when you're looking at this. Things like, what is economic output? What is a but-for analysis or alternate use? So we have about a paragraph description of each of those. And I think that might be helpful. That is our hope. And this is my last slide here. Is just some items for consideration. Dr. Bushman mentioned the tax expenditure report. Maybe there's some things that we do need to change. It's been around for about a dozen years now. It is a pretty lengthy PDF. It is required to be a part of the governor's budget report, so it is produced in a similar format. If you look at that and there are any changes that you want, any additional information, even things like a total, statewide total, adding up all the credits or all the deductions, or a different medium for looking at it. It's maybe a 150-page PDF. So that's something that you may want to consider. And then these SB 6 reports that we are doing, what we've seen in some other states, it's not uncommon for evaluations to be asked to determine whether the purpose of the incentive is met. And that is not something that we do. But one of the challenges with that is it's not uncommon for the purpose of an incentive not to be clear. So for instance, one of the projects last year, the retirement income exclusion. I mean, it seems maybe to some people on the surface what the purpose of that is, but some people would say the purpose is to attract retirees to Georgia. So if that is the purpose, then you want to specifically determine, do we have, people migrating to Georgia as a result of that? So you have to define the purpose. That would be one of the challenges with doing that. The 5-year projection that is required, there's a lot of work that goes into determining the economic activity and the fiscal impact for the most recent year of data that is available. So then projecting out 5 years, I feel like that most recent year really allows for an evaluation. The projection, I don't know that if it adds that much. It may be something to look at. Are there specific measures that you would like included in the reports? So the law gives us 4 components, but like within a component, it does not specifically say that the researchers should report the cost per job or the return on investment. And there's a fiscal return on investment, how much tax revenue is being generated for the tax revenue going out. There's also an economic ROI. So that's the change in the state GDP in relation to the tax revenue going out. So there may be some measures that you come up with over the next few months that you think that we'd like to see that going forward. And then finally, if there are types of recommendations that you would like to see in there, so things like if the researchers note that there's not data available to really evaluate this the way we would like, or the purpose is not clear, if there are certain things that you would like included in there, that may be something that well, it's definitely something we'd listen to, but maybe something you may want to communicate to us. So that was it.
Okay, just informational purposes, I think we'll be able to distribute these slides to the members, and then we'll make them available also online for those in the next couple of days that want to review these slides. But thank you for the presentation. You mind taking a question or two?
Sure.
Okay. Chairman Albers.
Thank you. Great presentation, and thank you for the work you have done on the audits up to this point. I think they've been very helpful and insightful for all of us. One of the things that I would like to see us focus on is proactively auditing as much as possible on a new tax credit incentive that might come forward to the General Assembly. And while I know you can't measure something that's not in effect, would it be possible for audits to look at all the outside effects prior to us actually initiating a new tax credit or incentive? Using third-party sources, trying to look out what other states have done, take some best guesses and swags, because when we look at a brand new incentive as an example, all we have is what someone is bringing to us, right? And of course, it's going to sound favorable to someone who is for it and not favorable to someone who might be opposed to it. But to give us some more concrete information and facts prior to initiating something new.
That's in performance audits. That is the type of work that we regularly do in audits. I mean, that we look at other states, we try to do comparisons. So that does not seem like something that the Department of Audits would be not capable of doing. When you're talking the time frame if you're talking about during a session with a 3-day turnaround, 5-day turnaround, it gets a little more challenging because we're trying to get information from other places. But
well, that might force different behavior of bringing things earlier. And having that set aside time prior to moving forward.
Yeah. One point that I should have mentioned when I mentioned the fiscal notes, that we take fiscal note requests anytime. We don't have to wait until the last couple of weeks of the session. We'll take them now. I mean, we can take them now. And in fact, I got one this week. That's great. That gives us a little time.
We try to be kind.
I understand.
Senator Hickman.
Yes, sir. Thank you for being here. I would have thought on any of these tax credits, we would have had a fiscal note before they were presented. That's not the case?
I think he's referring to more of a dynamic fiscal note. Is that fair to say? I'm not using the right terminology.
I don't know that would necessarily be dynamic. And you're correct. If we get a fiscal note request for proposed legislation, and there is. Now, is there an analysis of other states and what they have seen when they've enacted that may be a better question for Dr. Bushman, exactly how they incorporate that into the analysis. Is that something you could speak to, Dr. Bushman? Like, yes, other states, and how other states that may have a credit that is being introduced here, how that might be used
In the fiscal note
in developing a fiscal note.
In fiscal notes in particular, we would often, for some new tax break, we would probably look to see whether other states have enacted something similar and whether they have estimated the cost of that. Because if it's a new program, it may be very difficult to predict just based on Georgia in isolation,
Right.
what the utilization of that new credit or whatever may be. So we would look at other states to see if they've done something similar and what the cost has been to them.
Chairman Martin.
To the fiscal notes, and this wasn't my original question, but I wanted to follow up on Chairman Hageman's question. When you do fiscal notes for us, you just tell us the impact on the Georgia budget, right? So we don't necessarily get a fiscal note on something if it has a cap, because we know the fiscal impact will be at the cap. It will be no worse than that. So you do fiscal notes to tell us that over a projected number of years, this how much revenue will be impacted.
That's correct, but there will be requests for those that have a cap. So
Certainly,
right.
but it's
Right.
not necessarily always required for that. And so back to the original question I was going to ask is the dynamic versus static scoring of an economic model or process. Is there any process, and this may go to both of you, that at some point it's not linear, right? If the first dollar of credit gets this much benefit, the second dollar of credit gets that much benefit. There's a point where you reach a point of diminishing returns. Using yours, and I am one, so this is no disrespect to the seniors in our community, that if we were trying to attract seniors to Georgia, we don't want 100 million of them, right? I mean, just to use a crazy analogy. So is there a place where we're doing this credits that we want some of this business to come into Georgia, but an unlimited amount of that will reach a point of diminishing returns where we don't have enough raw materials to feed the factory, and that might be workers, that might be people that are dead. So is there any part of that done in the economic analysis when you're doing a dynamic fiscal note to know that when we're getting a real good return on our dollar to this point, and then we get right here, it kind of goes down because we have to put more education in place because we have to build people, we have to import folks to work there. Is there, when we get to I guess my question is this, when we get to the dynamic scoring of these things, do we do it longitudinally long enough to know when we've done what we want to do and that's enough?
So the fiscal notes themselves are not dynamic, and they do not try to estimate the economic activity that will result specifically from that legislation. So I would say that is not part of the fiscal note process.
And to follow, that's my thought, is our fiscal notes are static.
They are static.
The economic analysis we do later isn't, and I would echo, I believe Chairman Albert said it is perhaps on larger items in the best interest to do something that looks a little more dynamic, to find out what the true impact could be.
Right.
One comment to Senator Hickman's question about, do we always have a fiscal note? Should we have one? We probably should. Do we always have one? No. And sometimes the reality of it is there's only so many they can do in a certain amount of time, and sometimes we have to pick our priorities. Now, in this last session, due to the concern of a member, I waited till we could get the fiscal note, and when we finally got it, the sponsor of the bill said he didn't want his bill to be heard when we saw the cost of it. So I do think we need to look at some sort of a process that we get this going earlier, that people get a fiscal note, because we're all at crunch time, and it's like you don't want to have the guy not have his bill heard, but we don't know the cost of it. And so I think that's part of what we need to look at on this. An example would be retirement. retirement is a 2-year process. I'm not saying we have to do that, but we need something that gives time to get these properly analyzed, because we don't do that in every case. And so that's one of the issues we have.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor.
Thank you.
Our appreciation to you and the department, and Mr. Griffin, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
Believe economic development is up next. Do we have the team here from the Department of Economic Development? Oh, I'm sorry, Andrew, there you are. Capizzuto, am I saying that pretty close to the right?
That's right, exactly right, Capizzuto.
We will turn it over to you whenever you're ready, sir.
Good afternoon, members of the Joint Tax Credit Review Panel, Senate Finance, and House Ways and Means. We really appreciate you taking the time to convene this important panel today, and we're very excited to have the opportunity to present to you today. I'm Andrew Capizzuto. I'm the Chief Administrative Officer and General Counsel at the department. Commissioner Wilson sends his regards. He is in Georgia, the Republic, not the state, with the governor, so he couldn't be here today. With me, I've got a couple of our team members, Josh Stevens, who is our legislative affairs person, and then Lee Thomas, who you all know runs the Georgia Film Office. So I'm going to start first. I know many of you know what the Department of Economic Development does, but today we're really going to focus on two of our teams, Global Commerce and the film team, but I didn't want to miss an opportunity to highlight the work that the rest of our team is doing. You can see up here all that we have under our office. So from everything from arts to innovation and small business, tourism to international trade, we've got a team of Georgians that's working across the state and frankly the world to recruit business and drive economic activity here in Georgia. The one thing that all of our teams have in common is that we serve to market Georgia. We are the state's marketing arm. We also play a little bit different of a role with respect to incentives. You've heard from some of the economists today, you've heard from DOAA, and later you're going to hear from DCA and the Department of Revenue. Our role with credits is twofold. First, and mostly, we serve to market and educate with credits. You'll hear me talk a little bit later in the presentation about those credits that we administer, but our primary job is to market and educate companies that either are looking to locate in Georgia or who are already here and looking to expand. So this is our business incentives brochure. We update it every year. It provides a high-level overview of the incentives programs that we primarily deal with that we're marketing. This is available on our website for anyone to look at, and we have plenty of copies that we can make available if anyone is interested. I'm going to cover three main topics today. First, I'm going to tell a little bit of a different story than you've heard. I'm not an economist. I'm not an auditor. All I can tell you is what we see day in and day out when we're working with companies who are looking at Georgia. So I want to highlight the success that we've had over the last 10 years from a global commerce recruitment perspective, but then also from a film perspective. Secondly, I want to talk a little bit about some of the reasons that we in Georgia have been so successful over the last 10 years. And then lastly, I want to provide a high-level overview of some of our incentive programs, and I'll cover those incentives that we actually administer. At a later date, I'd love to get more down in the weeds with the panel's permission on some of our programs, and maybe we can go into an analysis of how we stack up against some of our competitor states. So we'll start first with this chart outlines the last 10 years, a decade of job growth from fiscal year 13 through the third quarter of this year. A couple things I'd like to point out with this chart is that from fiscal year 13 through about COVID, our job numbers were relatively consistent. Fiscal year 20, you can obviously see the COVID dip that happened when I'll never forget when March happened. The governor reached out to us and we completely shifted what our jobs were at economic development. We began to provide guidance and feedback to the business community in interpreting the executive orders that the governor's office and the legislature were working to issue. Our project pipeline hit pause overnight. So we went from working hundreds of projects with the uncertainty, pretty much every single one of those projects hit pause. That was very short-lived, though, starting in the fourth quarter of 2020 and moving into 2021. All those projects came back. We saw increased pent-up demand from projects that had been put on hold. And I think there were several reasons that happened. First, I think the leadership from the governor and the General Assembly with respect to how we handled COVID was tremendously important. I can't tell you so many stories from businesses that we've spoken to who were so thankful to be operating in Georgia and not in another state. You know, I had some CEOs call who had operations across the United States, and Georgia was one of the few places that they were able to continue operating their businesses. Secondly, I think the other thing that COVID highlighted was the fragility of the supply chain. So we've seen a tremendous amount of reshoring of American manufacturing. So and the supply chain network as well. So a lot of those companies who were previously relying upon getting their raw materials and goods from abroad started bringing those manufacturing operations back here to the United States. And so that's another reason that we've seen such tremendous growth coming out of COVID. Moving into 2022, you can obviously see that 51,000 job number there. That is inclusive of Hyundai and Rivian, who are responsible for about 15,000 of those 51,000 jobs. But the important thing to note out there is that even if you remove those 15,000 jobs from that year, we still would have broken our prior year's high record. This year, we're on track to do the same, creating almost 37,000 jobs through the third quarter of this year. So we've got one more quarter to go, and hopefully we'll have those numbers a little bit later this summer. Moving on to capital investment, the story is very similar. You can see through fiscal year 2013 through about 2020, the numbers were, in between 4 and 7 billion or so. Coming out of COVID, again, same story there. The investment numbers have obviously skyrocketed. A lot of that has to do with the cost associated with the manufacturing facilities we're seeing pertaining to electric vehicles and battery operations. So there are tremendous amounts of startup costs for those businesses. So you can see there in 21 and 22, those are inclusive of the Rivian, the Hyundais, the SK Innovation, the Hanwha Q-Cells. The startup costs for those manufacturing operations are tremendous, in the hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars for each of those projects. Same story is that, we've largely been successful, and I think with the increase in investment from the EV sector and increased automation, we're only going to see those capital investment numbers increase. So if you add all those figures up, it's about $100 billion worth of investment that the state of Georgia has seen over a 10-year window. This is what I'm sure a lot of you wanted to see. So this success has happened all over the state. So there's two things I want to call your attention here to. First is the map of Georgia on the right-hand side of the screen. So this map demonstrates over the last 10 years, so from July of 2012 to the present, we have located projects that economic development has actively worked in 152 out of 159 counties in Georgia. So that's a 95% placement rate. We've got 7 counties here who, in that 10-year window, have not had a project. We are working hard each and every day to get them one. Even though they haven't had a project directly, they've undoubtedly benefited from locations in adjacent counties and communities. The second thing that I would like to call to your attention is the infographic to the left-hand side. So in Georgia, 118 out of our 159 counties have a population of 50,000 or less. In that same fiscal year period from 2013 through 2023 year to date, we've located over 1,500 projects in those 118 counties that have resulted in the creation of 74,000 jobs and over $23 billion of investment. The bottom line is that the economic activity in Georgia is happening everywhere, and a lot of it is happening outside of Metro Atlanta. So we've talked a little bit about the highlighting the success that global commerce and corporate recruitment and retention have had in Georgia. I want to move now to talk a little bit about the film industry. So as you all know, the film tax credit was designed to spur investment into the film industry within the state of Georgia. I would say that it's done a pretty good job. So if you look at fiscal year 2007, we had about $135 million of direct investment from production companies in Georgia. In fiscal year 22, that increased to $4.4 billion. We've seen a tremendous increase in the amount of investment over the last 5 years from the film industry. And in fact, there's been an entire industry of small businesses that have been created by local Georgians that serve to provide services to the film industry, anything from costumers to catering to logistics and truck rentals, generator rentals. So there's an entire industry of small businesses that are owned by Georgians that are reliant upon the film industry for business. This chart here highlights the amount of stage space that we've seen from fiscal year 2009 through next fiscal year. And the reason we're going through next fiscal year, you might not be able to read those asterisks at the bottom. I'll read them for you. But for our fiscal year 23 numbers, that's inclusive of sound stages that are currently in development with a 2023 opening. And then for fiscal year 24, those represent sound stages that have been announced but have not yet started construction. So we've gone from having less than 50,000 square feet of sound stage space to, in 24, we'll have over 6 million square feet of sound stage. And one thing that I want to point out here is that these businesses do not qualify for the film tax credit. They are completely dependent upon production companies to utilize their space and their studios. These are companies and individuals who have made proactive investments into Georgia infrastructure to stand up studio space that the film industry can then use. With that 6 million square feet of stage space in 24, we will have passed New York and will only be behind California in the United States in terms of overall stage growth. And the other thing that I want to point out before we move on from this slide is that while this investment started out in Atlanta, it's really moved into more broader parts of the state. So recently, we've seen the retrofitting of a facility in Savannah, about 43,000 square feet, in Columbus, Georgia, of 100,000 square feet. And then there's going to be a purpose-built studio in Athens that's going to be about 82,000 square feet. Just like we've had success in corporate recruitment, the film activity has been all across Georgia. So this chart here outlines from 2007 to 2023, film activity by region. We've had nearly 1,000 productions that have filmed outside of Metro Atlanta, all across the state of Georgia. And there's really a couple of reasons that has happened, but in Georgia, we are very fortunate to have a very diverse geographic state. We're not like other states where the topography and the geography is, consistent across the state as a whole. We've got cityscapes, we've got mountains, we've got plains, we've got the coast. We have a tremendous amount of natural resources that allow production companies to undertake a wide variety of scenes within our state without having to go somewhere else. And that's all money that's being spent, across the state as a whole as they are undertaking these productions. And to highlight one example of a production that's happened here in Georgia, I'm sure many of you know Stranger Things, and this is for season 4. So with season 4 of Stranger Things, they filmed at over 40 locations across the state of Georgia. They had a payroll of over $95 million, and that was spread out amongst over 2,000 local crew members. They used over 15,000 hotel nights in Georgia. They spent more than $1.9 million on location fees and permits within local municipalities, and they paid more than $500,000 to off-duty police and firemen to provide security and support to their filming locations. So the point that I want to make here is that that's just one production. We're typically seeing somewhere on the range of 400 or so productions a year. Not all of them are as large as Stranger Things, but it's one thing that's hard to dispute is that the amount of money that the film industry is spending here in Georgia is having a tremendous impact on our economy and our local businesses. So I want to turn now to why we've been so successful. There are a lot of reasons we've had success here in Georgia. So if you look at some of the various outlets that rank states' economic success, there's a multitude of reasons here. So from a business recruitment and retention standpoint, I think it starts with workforce. We have very competitive labor market here. It starts with our people. We've got great institutions that train them from the K through 12 system to the technical college system to the university system. We're blessed with great logistics and infrastructure, and that's thanks in large part to a lot of the investments that the General Assembly has made into our ports, into our roads, into our rail systems. All of that has helped from a logistics perspective. The availability of developable sites. So coming out of COVID, speed to market was and continues to be one of the most important criteria that companies are evaluating when they're trying to stand up a new business. If we have a developable site, it gives them a leg up on their timeline. And especially with the EV industry right now, it's all about speed to market. They're trying to capture that market share from new consumers. We have a cooperative and responsive government. And then moving over to film, before I touch on the last one, which is why we're here to talk about, from a film perspective, you've heard me talk about a lot of these reasons. So we've got the Film Academy, good logistics and infrastructure, diversified geography, a great network of local businesses that have been stood up to support the industry, large amounts of studio space, camera-ready communities, and then the common thread amongst both of these, and there are multiple, but obviously we have stable and predictable incentive programs. And one of the things, I'm not an economist, I'm not an auditor. One thing that I can tell you though is that we're interacting with companies who are considering Georgia on a daily basis. And the thing that we hear when we're talking to these businesses, and especially the larger ones who are considering investing tens or hundreds of millions or even billions of dollars, that is a 20, 30, 40, 50-year decision for a company like that. These companies are sophisticated. They perform complex financial modeling when they are making these decisions. And to be able to rely on incentives that are predictable, that they can build into that model, is a very important factor for us to remain competitive. So when we are making large-scale changes to incentives, it impacts that company's ability to be able to model. It also impacts companies who might have already located here in the past. So if we're making changes to incentive programs, companies that have already decided to locate here would be potentially impacted by that as well. So I'm going to move on now, but one thing I want to point out is that, despite what you hear in the media headlines, we don't just give away incentives without getting something in return. Senator Gooch touched on this a little bit earlier in the presentation, but we in Georgia have what is called the gratuities clause. I call it a built-in guardrail. Y'all know what it is. The General Assembly shall not have the power to grant any donation or gratuity or the ability to forgive any debt or obligation owing to the public. Courts have interpreted this to mean that y'all can't give away something without recompense, can't give a gift. So really what it boils down to is that our incentive programs require a taxpayer to do something before they get a benefit in return. And just to highlight a couple of examples of that, so the job tax credit and the quality job tax credit, it requires a taxpayer to actually create a job or a number of jobs within a certain industry with benefits and at a certain wage requirement to be able to get that. If they do that, they're able to get credits that range anywhere from $1,250 a year all the way up to $5,000 annually for each job for up to 5 years. So over the course of a 5-year window, that can be very valuable. If that job goes away, the taxpayer's ability to earn the credit goes away. It's something that they are proactively creating jobs. Same thing for most of our other credits. The research and development credit requires a taxpayer to actually invest in research and development before they're able to take that credit and file it with the tax returns. The film tax credit, for example, requires pre-approval. It requires the Department of Economic Development to approve the production, determine that the in-state spend threshold has been met. As of this year, every production also has to go through a mandatory audit with the Department of Revenue. If they do all of those things, they can receive up to 30% of their eligible spend. And then finally, with the investment tax credit, if they invest in eligible expenses, they can earn up to 8% of that back. But these are all examples where, because of our gratuities clause, there is a built-in guardrail there. We're not just giving incentives away without getting something in return from the taxpayer. So finally, I'll touch on GDEC's role in administering some of these credit programs. I'll start first with film, interactive entertainment, and the music tax credit, which is now expired. But our role with respect to these credits is basically to certify a particular project as eligible. What we're doing is we're ensuring that that particular type of project is of the type that the legislature intended to qualify for the credit. We ensure that they meet the base spend threshold. We have an internal appeals process, so if there is a dispute over whether a project should or should not be certified, we handle that through an internal appeals process that the taxpayer can then go to OSE for if they disagree with our decision. We also prepare annual alternative marketing reports. So this is provided to the legislature every year, and it outlines how those taxpayers who have not used the Georgia logo and have done something alternatively have performed that alternative marketing. And then finally, we ensure that distribution requirements are met. So in order to get the uplift, they have to demonstrate that the production has been distributed. We ensure that they're actually doing that. Moving on to the Tourism Development Act, our role is similar to that in the film tax credit in that we, in conjunction with the Department of Community Affairs, certify projects. So we're looking at that application. We're making sure that that application and that project meets the criteria that have been set forth by the legislature. And then finally, I'll touch on competitive projects of regional significance. I call it CPRS for short. That's one that the legislature graciously extended this past session. So this is a sales and use tax exemption on construction materials. Our role at the department is to designate companies to be able to take advantage of that sales and use tax credit. It's one that we use incredibly sparingly and typically only for the largest and most impactful projects in Georgia. And we do not designate any project without receiving an approval from the governor. So that concludes my presentation. I really appreciate you giving us the opportunity to present today. And with that, I'll be happy to take any questions.
All right, thank you for the presentation. A couple of comments and questions before we go forward. And we do certainly appreciate Commissioner Wilson and Josh and everybody's work around the world in bringing jobs here. One thing I did want to point out on the job creation, and I know my district's a beneficiary of SK and QSales, so it's done well, but the job creation, those jobs aren't actually created yet. They may be created, but they're not, we don't have those jobs.
That is right. Those jobs have not been created. They will be created. And, you know, like I mentioned with respect to the claiming those credits, either from a statutory perspective or a discretionary perspective, we have requirements in order for them to take advantage of the credit. And for any discretionary incentives that we give them, we've got contractual commitments. So if they don't meet those commitments, they have to repay the incentives to the state.
So the reports that you guys do, who does those reports?
They're done internally. We have Salesforce reporting that we do. So for each project that we work, there's a profile that's created, and we input data about that particular project, and we're able to run reports off that.
Do you use M-Plan or what kind of a system?
Well, we do have, when we're evaluating discretionary grants, we do have a program that calculates net present value on just discretionary incentives. That was created by Dr. Alfie Meek at Georgia Tech.
Yeah, and so you guys do a great job. First of all, I said that, but there's a little bit of, we like independent reports. I think that's when we had the fiscal audit, so that if you're doing a job and you may be doing a great job, but then if you're self-reporting, there's a built-in bias, I guess, to find good stuff. I would be doing that if it was me, I know. So that's one of the questions we've got to look at going forward is making sure we get good numbers on all this. And again, on some of the jobs created, would those jobs have been created without the credit? Are they responsible for all of it? So those are some of the questions we've got going forward on that. But again, I don't want to take all the time up, so I know you've got some other questions if you want to respond to those.
Yes, sir. Representative Buckner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your information. I have it's kind of like a process question, I guess. Do you know if the benefits that you see from the economic development side are coordinated with or listed or included as benefits when the analysis is done by, say, the economist or the Department of Audits or the Fiscal Research Department? Do y'all
I think that's a tough
coordinate?
question to answer. So Department of Audits and Accounts has kind of a methodology that they use, and they're going to be using, you know, if it's a particular credit that we're administering, like film tax credit, for example, they will come to us and ask for data, and we provide them with data. They'll probably do the same for the Department of Revenue. And so they will take that data into consideration as they are going through their methodology and preparing their report. It's a very numbers-oriented process, I think, largely. I can't speak to their methodology at length. I think that question would be better served to them. You know, like I said throughout this presentation, I'm not an economist. I'm not an auditor. I can just tell you what I'm hearing from companies that we work with day in and day out.
If you don't mind, let me follow up then.
Sure.
From an economic development viewpoint, could some of the but-fors that are used sometimes, could those be a disincentive at times to companies that want to come to Georgia and trying to decide whether they want to come to Georgia or go somewhere else?
They could potentially be. When we are working, you know, not every project is the same. Sometimes we find out why we win projects or lose projects. Sometimes we don't. What I can tell you is that generally from an incentives perspective, I am constantly told by site selection consultants and companies that Georgia ranks at the middle or the back of the pack from an incentive standpoint. We're always getting outbid by other states, our competitor states. And I think part of the reason we've been so successful in spite of that is the list that I had up there. We've got a lot of assets here in the state that enable us to be competitive and continue to win. And you know, the other thing too that I think is important is that incentives are kind of they're a short-term solution from a business perspective, right? You have a tendency to see, especially with manufacturing operations, the goal when we're competing against other states is to help offset some of that initial startup cost so that they can then benefit from that. And the incentives eventually run out and the state recovers revenue as a result. So I can't speak specifically to any project. I can just tell you generally from what I hear from consultants and folks in the industry, we are routinely outbid by our competitor states from a purely incentive standpoint.
Thank you for what.
Sure.
And Andrew, you do have Lee Thomas and Joshua Stevens here with you?
They are both here, yes.
Okay. Do y'all have any, or we've got several questions. You don't mind continuing?
I don't
that?
mind continuing.
Okay.
No, that'd be fine.
Just want to make sure. Chair Lady Houston.
Thank you. The last tax credit you mentioned was the tax credit for large projects.
Yes, ma'am. It's a sales and use tax exemption, so it's not a credit, it's an exemption rather than a credit.
Okay, now who qualifies for that?
So we have a list of rules and regulations. It's mainly going to be large-scale manufacturing facilities is what we've used it for in the past. So your Rivians, your Hyundais.
Do you take in consideration in these small counties will probably never get a large project like that, and if you get a business, a manufacturing company that brings in 500 jobs or 400, that means as much to a small town who hasn't had a project in years as it does to these large. What concessions do you make to those towns?
Yes, Representative Houston. We definitely do. The definition of regionally significant depends on where you are in the state. So something in Atlanta.
When you say regional significance, you have to party with another county?
No, ma'am. No, I'm just saying where they're located. We would look at a project in the context of its impact on that particular community. So what might be regionally significant in a very rural community might not be in Atlanta, right? So we're gonna kind of take that into consideration as part of our evaluation so that we can get those regionally significant projects and use that designation in smaller parts of the state that have a smaller population or might not have the level of business investment that a large city might have. So what I'm saying is it's kind of a sliding scale.
A sliding scale. And so y'all make the decisions on an individual basis, not what's in statute?
Correct.
All right. Thank you.
Senator Doc Rett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for being here. Just a comment, question. Basically, you're saying these tax credits are not a gratuity. but they encourage economic development which benefits the taxpayers and the communities at large.
Correct. What I'm saying, and I'm not a policy maker, I don't make policy, we just apply what policy the legislature enacts. But yes, because of the gratuities clause, there has to be some benefit flowing back to the state of Georgia as consideration for the credit.
And you're also saying that the reason Georgia has been so successful is because of our stable and predictive incentives over the years with these programs?
That is definitely one of the reasons we've been successful, yes.
And that's helped us with competition with other states?
Yes, it has.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Representative Fry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We appreciate all y'all are doing. You're keeping the state rolling. You're recruiting great businesses here. I want to talk about, if we could go back to the idea that, what was that $95 million payroll with the
Stranger Things.
Stranger Things? Was that one season, 1 year?
It was one season, so it was season 4.
And so what is the time period in a season?
Well, I think it depends on the particular production. I think they vary. It might be 1 year, it might be less than a year. I think it just depends on how long it takes for them to complete that season.
Okay, so season 4 was $95 million in approximately a year. What size industry does that $95 million payroll equate to?
I mean, it's kind of hard to quantify that, but I mean, that would be a very good sized manufacturer's entire project cost. So something that that a manufacturer might be incurring over a 3 to 5 year period. Stranger Things isn't doing that in 8 months or 15 months, somewhere in that time frame.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your answer.
Thank you.
Senator Hodges.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for being here, and you guys do a great job for us.
Thank you.
My question, I wanted to follow up on Chairman Huffstetler's question about the self-reporting that you do on jobs created and spending. Is that work audited by the Department of Audits?
It is not, no.
Okay, thank you.
Chairman Tillery.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Andrew. I want to tell you, you do an excellent job for the department. It's always a pleasure to talk with you, so thank you for your help and your work.
Thank you, Chairman.
I do want to maybe ease some concerns. I don't know where the committee goes as a whole, but what I've heard from our group and the individual members as they've spoken about this is, I don't think anybody's out to end any specific credit. I don't think anyone expects this study committee will come back and recommend ending the entire film tax credit. They may recommend ending us paying for private jets on film tax credits. I don't think that they're going to recommend that we end the research and development tax credit. They may recommend that we end or somehow find a way to limit when folks are going out into different businesses and saying, hey, look, you actually would qualify if you just reclassify your clerical employee as an R&D employee. I think those are some of the things that we're hearing that are causing issues. With that information, does the department have any suggestions for us on things that might be ways we can clean up these credits that would probably provide a whole lot of heartburn alleviation to some of the folks in the back of the room, or at the same time would give us some guidance from your wisdom working in the projects?
Yeah, so as I came here today, I was not prepared to answer a question like that. I think that's something that we can definitely look into and come back at future meetings. And if we do have suggestions on things that, would help our credit programs, either from a competitive standpoint or a tightening standpoint, we'd be happy to have those conversations at a later date.
And one follow-up on that, I think another thing that might help alleviate concerns maybe among the legislature is we hear rumors from time to time about different things that may be pending. I know that we've tried to have conversations more in depth with the department about that. We're hearing some rumors now. We would love to not be in the position that we were in this past session to relive that and relitigate what happened maybe from January to March. So any discussions that we can have, I personally, maybe the other members have, I haven't heard anything about plans to be expecting since before the end of session. So any discussions that we could have now, I think would help us a ton as we enter 2024.
Yeah, we would be happy to have those conversations. Obviously, it's a little nuanced in that we're always under NDA, right, when we're working these projects, but when we get to the point where there's an impact on the budget, we have a decision, we would be happy to have those conversations with the legislature.
see any more questions, but Andrew, thank you and your
Chairman.
team and Commissioner Wilson for all that you do.
Thank you.
Is Commissioner Nunn? There you are with DCA.
Now, the last time I heard, Commissioner Dunn was going to be in California right now, so something happened in between.
Oh, Commissioner, we appreciate you being here, and I don't know if he's, I see him sneaking out of the room, but I did get a message earlier that we have a senator with a birthday possibly today, and before he slips out of the room, is Senator Anavatarte, is it your birthday today? Happy birthday. Commissioner Nunn?
I thought we were going to have to sing, so thank you. Thank you, Chairman and members of the committee. As a Georgian, for the effort you're embarking on, and as a state agency head for the opportunity to present to you this afternoon. I know that we've been here for a while. I was simply asked to introduce the agency and the credits that we administer, so let me start by doing that. I'm joined today by a couple of my colleagues. I'm Christopher Nunn. I'm the Commissioner of DCA. Rusty Haygood is with me. He's my Deputy Commissioner. Ryan Evans is our Head of External Affairs. And I do have another of my colleagues who is actually pinch hitting for me on the West Coast today, who I look forward to introducing into this discussion as we go forward. DCA, as the state's community development agency, is responsible for housing, infrastructure, economic development, finance, and technical assistance. So we are responsible for a myriad of grant and loan programs, planning and technical assistance ranging from downtown development to construction codes. As it relates to this commission, we do have administrative responsibility for 9 programs that relate to the tax code. And so, like Andrew, I am not an economist, but I'm going to try to offer a little bit of on-the-ground perspective, some real-world perspective. I won't delve deep. Hopefully we'll have an opportunity to go into that at a later point in time. But I do want to share a few highlights. I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, but I did share with you just kind of some one-pagers on each. And again, I'll try to go through those here momentarily. The 9 credits or tax-related programs that we're responsible for include the Job Tax Credit Program, from which there are a few other programs that flow off of that: the military zones, opportunity zones, less developed census tracts. I'll talk about the housing tax credits, historic preservation credits, the rural zone program, the Georgia Agribusiness and Rural Jobs Act, and the Tourism Development Act. But before I do, just as a little bit of background, prior to public service, I spent my business career at Arthur Andersen, and then I led a large regional public accounting firm. I hired many partners and professionals to navigate state and local tax issues, not just in Georgia, but also in other states with whom we compete. And based on that experience, I can attest that, tax credits can be beneficial. I think you heard Dr. Dorfman earlier. They can be beneficial. They do provide, as Representative Buckner asked, they provide pay-for-performance incentives. As Senator Gooch pointed out, they enable the state to engage private entities in public policy goals. Direct funding is not possible in many cases because of the constitutional prohibitions we have. And then they also support specific public policy objectives. However, my point is they're very complex. In fact, each credit is different, but in general, they are successful because, again, they're designed to achieve public policy objectives. They have established guardrails. They are effectively administered by talented professionals. They engage private sector in a manner that is predictable, and they pay for performance. So let's start with the job tax credit. When this program was launched in 1990, the program was simply focused on encouraging job creation in the poorest 40 counties in the state. But it was iteratively expanded over time, and by 2002, it was expanded statewide to all 159 counties to encourage further economic development and encourage businesses to locate and expand in the state. Arguably, the impact of this particular program is that it supports the state's pro-business reputation and our economic development success. But I think you would be hard-pressed to say that it does not definitively address that public policy objective. In terms of managing this program, DCA prepares an annual tier ranking, which you may have heard us talk a little bit about, that governs the level of credit that is available based on the county and the state. We also provide technical assistance regarding the eligibility. We have a CPA on staff that works with companies and works with accountants to understand specific eligibility when those questions arise. The program is marketed by economic developers, whether those are state or local economic developers, but also by accountants who are working with existing industry clients. And then lastly, this credit is claimed through and administered by the Department of Revenue. And again, this I think goes back, Senator Hustetler, to the question you asked. It does not matter what the state's offer is. Until those jobs have been actually created and maintained, no credit is eligible to be claimed. A couple of key programs, or a couple of key points before I move on. This program is fundamental to every state and local recruitment offer that takes place. But it is also a statutory incentive that is available to any existing industry that seeks to grow and meets the eligibility criteria. I already said, this is a pay-for-performance incentive. Chairman Blackman, I think you asked the question earlier, but there are 41 other states with whom we compete that offer a similar version of incentives. There is perhaps no perfect job tax credit program, but Georgia's program has yielded significant success. You were asking about what do other states do, and we won't go through 41 states, but to give you an idea, in Georgia we offer from $750 to $3,500 per job based on the tier. In our neighbors to the north, in Tennessee, they offer $4,500 across the board in 4 tiers. Now you have to create different numbers of jobs in each, same in Georgia. And in our neighbor in South Carolina that we compete with significantly, they actually have increased the job tax incentive for their tier 1 or our lowest tier counties to $25,000 per job. Now, there's again no one program, but this has been that's a little bit of background on the job tax credits. There's a little information about the less developed census tracts and others, but I'm going to move on. Directly tied to job creation are issues of workforce and workforce housing. In fact, this is the #1 issue that affects communities today. So housing tax credits are the next tool that I will speak to. And the policy objective for housing tax credits is to construct and rehabilitate affordable rental housing, extending the benefits of the federal tax credit. In terms of impact, from 2018 to date, we have funded 347 senior and workforce housing developments in 122 communities across the state. This program definitively addresses the public policy objective. We can talk more about the economic benefits, which I think are fantastic, but are ancillary to the primary policy objective that the legislature put in place. In terms of how those are managed, the credits are managed in conjunction with and they leverage the federal tax credit, all by a team of professionals who have finance and construction experience. They are allocated through a rigorous and competitive process that includes annual public input and strict adherence to solid real estate fundamentals. I mentioned that these are competitive. In fact, last year we awarded approximately 45 credit awards and we had approximately 150 to 155 eligible applications. It's a very highly competitive program. And then the finance team monitors these until the units are put into service. And then our compliance team administers that program for the life of the affordability period, which is what the state gets in return for the credit. That affordability period is 30 years that we monitor those developments. So key points. Tax credits are the only proven tool to develop multifamily housing supply. This is not a rental subsidy, so it's not to be confused with Section 8. Again, they pay for performance. You don't claim the credits until you put the units in service. They have significant guardrails and sound real estate fundamentals, ensuring that this public-private partnership is effective. And finally, I mentioned that this is a tool that helps to develop, to finance senior and workforce housing. But I think that's important to clarify, because too often I hear this program touted as a benefit to teachers and first responders, which is true in some communities in the state. But I think more broadly, it is important to understand that these developments address a housing need that includes a vital sector of our workforce. Those who aren't earning at the high or even middle income level. So mathematically, that's like 40% of our households who are income eligible. By no means am I saying that this is the only solution. It doesn't address home ownership, which is important for 65% of the population, but it certainly meets a need in our state for seniors who are on fixed income, those who have mental and physical manufacturing, service personnel in schools, and pretty much anyone in a job in the state that is earning less than $25 an hour. Moving on. At the height of COVID, the legislature moved the state's Historic Preservation Division to DCA from the Department of Natural Resources. One reason I am told is to align historic credits and housing credits, which at times can be complementary. Since 2002, the historic preservation credits have been intended to preserve and reuse historic structures to stimulate economic development, revitalize historic downtowns and neighborhoods, and to enrich cultural tourism. In 2015, this program began to undergo fundamental change, geared more to financing large-scale commercial redevelopment. In terms of impact, between 2008 and 2017, there were 341 preservation projects that occurred in 33 counties, 25 of them rural. Of those projects, 45% were historic homes, which had a $100,000 credit cap. 55% were commercial properties, which had at the time a $300,000 credit cap. These are places like the Daniel Ashley Hotel in Valdosta, which is now senior housing, the Han Building in Pelham, which is now workforce housing, the old Coca-Cola building in Columbus, that is now the headquarters of Salt Life Apparel, the Greyhound Station in Savannah. Many of y'all enjoy the Gray Restaurant, and the Ponce City Market in Atlanta. All of those projects were subject to the $300,000 cap in state credits. Now, in terms of managing this program, DOR is the administering agency, but DCA and the Office of Historic Preservation actually confirm the eligibility for these credits and then certify the expenditures against which credits are claimed. We've got a team of professionals that review, and this works the same way for the federal credits. They review and issue a Part A that gives people the green light to embark upon historic rehab, and then 2 to 3 years once that project is completed, we review and issue a Part B that certifies the expenses and can be submitted to DOR to claim credits. So DOR is the administering agency. DCA ensures eligibility. Prior to 2015, I understand that the fiscal impact or the credits utilized each year were less than $5 million. Since 2015, the credits are subject to higher project caps and a cumulative $25 million annual cap, which has been exhausted every year. There is also, I should note, less certainty and predictability, something Andrew talked about in the process, as the cumulative cap is actually consumed on a first-come, first-served basis. happy to talk about that more later. Let me really quickly touch on the last three. The next program stems from House Rural Development Council efforts in 2017. The Rural Zone program was simply intended to encourage locally driven economic development and historic downtown revitalization. Lots of benefits from a marketing standpoint. We have a really strong pipeline of communities who apply for this designation every year. In fact, 52 have received downtown designations, and some, like Bainbridge, my hometown in Perry, and Cornelia, have really leveraged this tool as part of a broad-scale economic plan. Other designees have really put minimal effort into leveraging the designation, and to date, I understand that less than $3 million in credits have actually been claimed. This was patterned after the Opportunity Zone with increased emphasis on retail and driving jobs and foot traffic into downtowns, but a reduced benefit based on the fiscal impacts and characteristics of those jobs and jobs quality. Next, I'll talk about the Georgia Agribusiness and Rural Jobs Act, which was a legislated policy initiative, I believe, in 2017 to provide access to capital for companies in rural areas. In exchange for $60 million in tax credits, these rural funds, 5 of them, raised $100 million and have invested $112 in 36 companies. That contributed capital includes $101 million of debt. And the rural funds report that they've created 964 jobs and retained another 760. I will highlight key points. Program is administered under guardrails that were established by DCA, but the state administrative and compliance oversight is limited due to the lack of any administrative funding. The performance period for that initial program ends June 30th of this year. So what, 2 weeks? And then last but not least, and Andrew already talked about this, the Tourism Development Act, which was enacted, I believe, in 2013. This was intended to create and expand tourism attractions across the state. In all honesty, we have only approved 8 projects over the life of this program. Half of those new investments in the state, half expansion of existing operations. And that program, I'm happy to talk about further, but it looks like there may be some questions, has some administrative challenges that we can talk about. That really concludes the presentation. I'm happy to entertain questions.
All right, and we actually are not going to do questions.
Okay.
Because we've got one more presentation. It's very important, but we've got other meetings coming. But I just had one comment on that, and it's really the same as with economic development. The program you talked about, the 60 million, I guess the 5 companies, that's 12 million each, and we're doing a self-reporting. I kind of feel like if somebody's getting $12 million, there ought to be some sort of audit done on them. And I hope we can work together on changing, our reporting system and confidence of these programs going forward.
Happy to do that.
Thanks.
Okay. Commissioner, thank you so much for altering your plans to be with us here today. I appreciate the presentation, the comments, and I know we'll probably be circling back up with you at some other date. The time is getting a little short. We have one more department to present today, and that's the Department of Revenue. I did see the commissioner there. Last but certainly not least, appreciate y'all being with us today. I know you've sat back there patiently waiting. How you doing, sir? Good. Hey, how you doing?
I'll be right here. Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. We're happy to be here today to present and assist with your important work. First, I should get it out of the way that I'm not an economist either, but I have a lot of respect for Drs. Dorfman and Bushman, who we've worked with quite a bit over the years. I'm going to introduce some members of the department that are my experts. Kelsey Finn is the Director of Income Tax Policy. Chester Cook is the Deputy State Revenue Commissioner. Austin Gibbons is our Director of External Affairs and Communications. Charles Elrod, our Senior Managing Attorney for Tax Operations. and Joe Mountain is our Legislative and Legal Affairs Specialist. Now we're going to give you an overview of income tax credits and sales tax exemptions. And Kelsey does have a slide with all the income tax credits on it, so we will answer that question, but I won't spoil it right now. But without further ado, Kelsey Finn.
And while Kelsey's coming up there, if I can, on behalf of our committee, and maybe Chairman Huffstedler would likely agree, you have an outstanding team and y'all do an outstanding job, and we really appreciate the support that you give us at the Ways and Means.
Let's see, can you guys hear me well, or? All right, yeah. So I know agencies were asked to present all the credits that they administer. DOR administers over 50 income tax credits, so hopefully none of you have anywhere to be in the next few hours. But kidding. Instead, we're going to go provide an overview of how the tax credit process works at DOR. We're happy to give a deeper dive into individual credits and serve as a resource as questions come up. Yeah. Right. How do I get to the next slide? Thanks. Is it this one? Okay. No, that's, yeah. Okay. So in this first slide, we have listed out the 50+ income tax credits that are administered by the department. For reference, we have color-coded the credits to show how they're being used. 13 of these credits have been sunsetted or repealed, and 10 of which are still being carried forward. This means that while these credits are no longer generated, taxpayers that previously earned these credits are carrying the credit forward to be used on future tax liability. This next slide provides a brief snapshot of different, oops, went back. That's, how do I go backwards? Okay, thank you. Okay. This next slide provides a brief snapshot of different processes that may apply to specific tax credits. We'll expand on this in later slides, but briefly, pre-approval is a process normally applied to capped credits in which a taxpayer estimates the amount they will qualify for prior to earning a credit. Some credits can be transferred or sold, and lastly, some credits can be applied against withholding. Credits can be capped or uncapped. There are several types of capped credits. An individual or entity level cap is an annual cap that limits each taxpayer to a statutory dollar value or an amount based on a percentage of the taxpayer's income tax liability. An aggregate cap is a cap on the tax credit as a whole, which limits the credit to a specific appropriated amount for that tax year, split between all qualified taxpayers. It's generally first come, first serve. And donation credits are often capped at the individual entity level, the donor, and at the organization level by the donee receiving entity. And pre-approval process. Cap credits are generally require pre-approval, as it's not possible to implement a credit cap via tax returns. The pre-approval process generally requires taxpayers to apply with an estimate of what they believe they will qualify for. When the credit is generated, the credit amount is adjusted down to the value they actually earned. For aggregate caps, the credit is first come, first serve. Pre-approved amounts are prorated on the day that the cap is met. Following the day that the cap is met, additional applicants are then denied for approval, even if they meet the certification requirements. Many aggregate caps are met in one day. While the pre-approval process does provide taxpayers the opportunity to pre-qualify for their tax credit ahead of filing their return, it may also incentivize taxpayers to overestimate what they will qualify for on their pre-approval application. This is because the pre-approved amount is the maximum they can receive as a credit. After adjustments are made, any amount of the pre-approved amount above the adjusted amount is considered lost and not added back into the pot for other taxpayers. So, for example, if a taxpayer is approved for $500,000, then $500,000 is removed from the aggregate cap. If that taxpayer ends up only qualifying for $200,000, then $300,000 is used from the cap but not actually generated as a tax credit. That being said, if the taxpayer had estimated $200,000 but actually qualified for $500,000, they would be limited to $200,000, despite exceeding their estimate and providing greater economic stimulus to the state. In contrast, uncapped credits are not subject to an annual predetermined limit, but they are still limited. These limitations stem from the requirements outlined in the statute. To qualify, taxpayers must be engaged in some benefit to the state of Georgia to earn a credit against their tax liability. These requirements include, but are not limited to, the amount they invest in the state, the number of jobs they created, or the use of Georgia vendors or companies. Now we'll discuss the steps in the credit process. Not every credit has all of these steps, and the order that they occur is based on the statute. So pre-certifying is when an applicant is required to meet criteria prior to moving forward with generating the credit. Pre-approval is usually for capped credits. Taxpayers generally submit a request to the Georgia Tax Center, and for aggregate caps, it's a first-come, first-served basis until the cap is met. Generating is the step when the tax credit certificate is actually created. Allocating is when the originator assigns credit amounts to related entities or shareholders on their return. And utilizing occurs when the taxpayer is actually applying the credit against tax liability on their tax return. And lastly, auditing occurs when pre-certified amounts are adjusted based on audit findings. For example, with the film tax credit, every credit is subject to a mandatory audit prior to credit generation. The estimated amount that is pre-certified by economic development is then adjusted by auditors to reflect actual expenditures in Georgia. This change was made by the legislature in 2020. I'll briefly touch on the difference between allocating and transferring a credit. Most credits cannot be sold or transferred, but many credits can be allocated. An allocated or assigned credit is a credit that is moved to partners or shareholders of an entity. A transfer is generally a sale of a credit to another entity with Georgia tax liability. Transfers occur because a company that does not qualify for the credit may buy a tax credit from a company that did earn one. The company that purchases the credit can then apply it against their Georgia tax liability. The company selling the credit must identify who the credit is being sold by and who it is being sold to. On this last slide, I'll briefly touch on common challenges that DOR faces when administering tax credits. Some of these challenges stem from statutory requirements, and others are the result of how tax administration works in practice. So first one, when a pass-through entity claims a credit at a lower level despite generating the credit at a higher level. The lower level claims it before it's actually generated on the return of the higher level. They're claiming a credit that does not actually exist. Second B, programming and monitoring are more difficult when a statute requires that entities generate their credit in 1 year and must wait to utilize it until the next year. It's also difficult to administer credits that become uncapped during the tax year based on how it's in the statute. And then, as mentioned before, the pre-approval process incentivizes entities to estimate higher than the amount they will qualify for because pre-approved credit amounts can only be adjusted down. Large portions of annual statutory caps go unused due to that disconnect. This means otherwise qualified taxpayers missed out on the tax credit despite providing economic incentives to the state. And lastly, like many other agencies, DOR faces difficulties with staff recruitment and retention. And now I'll hand it over to Charles Elrod to discuss sales tax.
All right, thanks, Kelsey. When I was asked to speak today, I found out a couple things. One, I'm here to talk about sales tax, but I found out this meeting is almost entirely for tax credits, and two, I was going to go last. So the first note I wrote was be swift. So I'm not going to speak very long. I think the department is ready to answer questions y'all may have here today on tax credits, but I'm obviously here to answer anything you may have on the exemption side as well. So I've heard 101 tax credits today, so this is kind of freshman level sales tax exemption side of the house. First and foremost, there are over 100 of them in Georgia. So let me go ahead and get there. Sorry about that. That's me. And there's that, over 100. I think it's like 103, 104 currently is where we stand. And while the tax credits have been more common recently from an incentive perspective, we certainly have them on the sales tax exemption side of the house, but they're just not coming from the legislature as frequently these days. So the first thing I want to do is just talk through kind of what what types of exemptions are out there, which is where I should probably start and say, this is not all about business economic incentives, which is also a reason why I'm going to move rather swiftly as promised. So you can see here, product-based exemptions. We heard earlier in the day, somebody referred to necessity type exemptions. That's exactly what you have here. If you look at the first three being hearing aids, prescription drugs, oxygen, we're all very familiar with the necessity exemptions. Groceries fall into this list as well. The others I'm not going to really walk through. They don't really fit in the same category. Lottery tickets are tax exempt solely because of the fact that the state generates revenue through other means of just the actual overall sales. Won't get into cookies, going to skip over the computer software. So I'm going to turn over to the other side. The organization-based exemptions, that really has like two subparts. One is kind of the nonprofit government school sector, and then the private sector, which is obviously the focus more here today. So you see your nonprofits right there. I'll stop and give the public services announcement that not everything that all 501c3 purchased in the state of Georgia are tax exempt. We get that question probably 15 to 30 times a day. But you can see here, these are purchases made by volunteer health centers, nonprofit hospitals. Those would serve as examples of 501c3s that can qualify for tax exempt purchases. You see a prime example of schools. I don't know why it even says the construction projects for the University of Georgia system. The whole system can make their purchases tax exempt as well. And let's see if we're missing anything out. Oh, and then the government agencies too, at both the state level and the local, and even all the way down to the municipalities. So, but that's part A of the organization-based exemptions, and you can see none of those are the private sector. In the private side of things, they're more of hybrids in a lot of ways, in that they're private companies that are going to make them eligible, but it's what they're purchasing, which is kind of the product side, that those combined are what are going to entitle those particular companies for the exemption. And all of them, or at least almost all of these exemptions, are incentive-based. So you're talking about easy ones to think about would be our manufacturing exemption. You have to be, you have to qualify as a manufacturer, and then you're eligible to buy certain manufacturing equipment and machinery. Andrew was here earlier today. He touched on both competitive projects, as well as, I think he had up on his presentation, he had Tourism and Development Act, two of the bigger, I guess, exemptions that have come out in the last 10 or 15 years that companies can take advantage of. And another example that is getting a lot of attention these days would be your high technology data centers. So that's just a potpourri of the type of exemptions. As I said, there are over 100. If I wanted to walk through all 100, I'd probably be on 48 right now, which is crab meats can be bought by licensed crabbers without paying sales tax. So I figured that we didn't want to go through all 103 of them today. So the process, and I guess this is, again, I'm moving fast here, but DOR's part, we just administer, we follow the directions given us to by the legislature. But I think it's probably important to point out these four kind of buckets right here. I'm not actually going to go in order. The self-help is where I'll go first. It's the easiest. There's a big compliance component to that. Taxpayers just come on to the website, they print out their form. Usually oftentimes it's going to be an ST5, and that's what they hand to the vendors when they need to make tax-exempt purchases. So that has the least amount of administration, and then from a DOR perspective, because it's primarily voluntary compliance, we're really only involved on the backside from more of an audit perspective. Next, let's see here, where do we want to go? Let's go to application-based. Printed out on two sides, and now I can't even figure out where I am. All right, application-based. So this actually has two subparts as well, but it's pretty simple on its face. We want to make sure that that the entity that thinks that they're entitled to the exemption does indeed qualify, and then we hand them either a letter of authorization or a certificate of exemption, and off they go on their merry way. It's just one extra step over what you see at self-help. I will also add a big exemption in the state. It goes through our GATE program for agriculture, and we actually are not in charge of that application. We're not the gatekeeper, no pun intended, but rather agriculture hands out the GATE cards, and we are just the back-end administrator of the GATE program. Reporting requirements up there in the upper right. Oftentimes, revenue's tasked with receiving annual reports. Usually the things that we're primarily looking to, the data we're capturing is how much is the credit worth to the state, just to get figures on that. And then there's the ongoing compliance for somebody who has prereqs that need to be met and need to continuously be met through the life of a particular exemption. So we are always mindful to make sure that we get that data collected correctly. And that leads us finally with the refund process. It's here for capped exemptions, but I'll just stop and say that everything else here has been kind of front end, where taxpayers can avail themselves of ways to go out and not pay tax on the front end. Large percentage of our tax exemptions are through a refund process, and you can see that a few of them are actually even capped, and I believe that the zoos and aquariums was extended. The sunset provision was extended in this last session, and I think it's an additional 800,000, maybe what the add-on amount is for that. So nothing special there. I'm holding on. So I'll flip to the next one, and I'm not going to walk through this, but this is administration at work right here. Is all this is for sales tax exemptions. You can see the word documentation over and over again, and that's a lot of the grunt work of what takes place to make sure that we are handing out exemptions properly. Not going to go through each and every one of these again. We're moving. And look at there. Did anybody want to talk about that crab meat exemption again? So I need to wear glasses when I come up to do this, and I put my glasses on over there for 2 seconds, and I looked up and said, I'm just going to take my glasses off. I don't want to see my audience right here at 3:30 this afternoon. So anyway, I appreciate y'all hanging in there, and on the behalf of the department, I guess we're ready to take any questions you may have, Chairman.
You just did a remarkable job. There aren't any lights lighted up at all. So I did want to ask real quick, if I could, Commissioner, maybe something we can circle back up on. Y'all do a really good job during session of letting us know when there are issues or problems that may be, difficult for you to administer, related to any particular legislation. I know you mentioned some things during your presentation. I think slide 12 had, different things that can be problematic. Is there any examples under the credits that might, be overly burdensome from an administrative standpoint that you'd be willing to share? Not to speak to the merit of any credit, just whether or not the administrative component is easier than another.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you for that question, Mr. Chairman. My Deputy State Revenue Commissioner has also been the Director of Audits and been responsible for making sure taxpayers provided the right documentation and the forms that they should have. And he would be better able to address that particular question. Chester, if you please.
And we can... Now the board's lit up there.
Former auditor comes up and it starts storming. Yeah, so a little bit was addressed in our presentation. So for us, right, we're really concerned about making the trains run on time and making sure whatever policy the legislature would like to put in place, that we do it effectively, efficiently. So things such as when we have pre-approval credits, making sure that the statute's clear on the timing of when those are, how the caps work, and how when sort of the rubber meets the road, how those come through and people could claim the credits. So an example which is noted in there, just to provide one, and we're certainly glad to have conversations as you look through and see all of this stuff, would be some of the pre-approval credits. And examples of those might be, the SSO for schools, rural hospital, those kinds of things. And then which the legislature's generally increased some of the caps on some of those, particularly as businesses and what we have now, the pass-through exemption where entities can elect to be traded as a corporation, so therefore they can use these credits now as, making sure we look at, what the results of those are. We do have some situations where, for example, corporations are applying for the credit and they have to come in and estimate the amount of income they're going to have, and then when they come in to actually get the credit, it turns out it may be different and may be lower. So what's happening in that situation is their credit's actually being reduced even though they made a larger contribution, which may not have been fully what was intended, but is sort of a result there. Just sort of little things like that we go on. In terms of, broadly for the credits, most of them are pretty clear. The timing and how they go forward with the carry forwards, making sure we're very clear on how those work and what the processes are, for example, to apply those that can against withholding. And then for any particular credit, making sure that we're certain of which group of taxpayers are made to go within that group to avoid controversies later. It makes us easier on the front end and the back end to do that. But in terms of credits in general, particularly tax credits, that's obviously a big piece of our work, a big piece of our audit function. We look at a lot of that. Obviously, film tax, 100% audit now. We were already looking at a large piece of that already, even before, along with our other tax credits. The larger they are, the more incentives that are given, the higher the likelihood that we'll be paying that person a visit to make sure they did what they said they were going to do.
Question, but first I did want to say I do think the blue crab fishermen had a hell of a lobbyist back in the 60s because they've hung on to that pretty good. This is more of a help, and Chairman Tillery talked about the private jets, and we've had audits where they're using them for personal chefs or trainers. There was a production piece that was made in New York. I think it was $40-something thousand, but they've got an entity in Georgia, so even though it wasn't made here, we let it count towards the credits as well as travel back and forth. So I guess my ask would be to help us go through all these regulations from the past and maybe look at, how can we revise these to where we feel like the taxpayers more comfortable with what they are spending the money on. So if you guys could put some effort into helping us with that process, I think that's one of the things we need to look at going forward is the past regulations and maybe tweaking them a little bit.
Yeah, sure. And in particular, you're mentioning the film tax credit with the regulations and then the procedures we have in place now. It is extremely tight. Our procedures for doing that are tighter than any other. New York, California, our procedures are way tighter than those other states. So we're seeing it at a very granular level. So when you talk about things from a policy perspective that you would like to see in or out, jets, which is sort of a legislative thing, our procedures are so fairly tight now that from an administrative perspective, the more that's defined, that actually is easier for both us as well as the third parties that are doing the audits. But we'd certainly be glad to have that conversation because we're certainly at a good spot to have that because of how granular and 100% audits that are going on with that particular credit.
Representative Bentley, are you?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your presentation. I was just really interested in the slide that showed the product-based exemptions and curious to know how to get a product on that exemption list. But thank you.
Thank you, Representative. Chairman Tillery.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question just about process. Could you explain to us what it means for a credit to be applied against a withholding? We started to hear a lot of bubbling about that and maybe some consternation, and maybe you can help us understand why we're starting to hear the consternation that we're starting to hear about that. I just don't understand why.
Sure. So several credits, not all tax credits, will allow you to apply it against withholding. The legislature expanded the number of credits with what we call the withholding benefit a few years ago to allow to go to a few more credits. So the way it works is if you don't have enough tax liability during that year for those particular credits that allow it, then you can elect to take that credit against withholding. So if you had a liability of $10,000 and you had $20,000 of, say, job tax credit in a Tier 1 county, you could wipe 100% of your liability out, but then you could make an election to take that difference against withholding, which is an electronic process that we do. So then they get to apply the remaining credit against withholding to utilize it.
I guess what I was asking is, could you explain why are we starting to hear more about that? Why is that? Do you know why folks are having a lot more questions about that from a policy side?
Representative Martin, were you?
I think recognize. I think the reason it's popped up on my thing is this is, correct me if I'm wrong, sir, but this is if you work for a company and they withhold your 6.75% your tax, they use the credit to pay for it. So they actually take the employee's money that they keep it and they monetize that and then use that credit. And so it's a bit different than using it for a credit of a tax that the company itself would owe.
Correct, and also just to clarify, all the credits that have a withholding benefit are only for the generators referred to it, or the entity that created the credit and did the activity in order to get the credit. So those that are even transferable that do have a withholding benefit, that does not pass along to subsequent purchasers of the credit, so they can't do that. It's only what we refer to as the generator of the credit.
Senator Hickman.
Thank you, sir. Just a couple of quick questions. First of all, being a numbers person, do we know how much the sales tax exemptions are costing us? And you say there's 103 exemptions. How much is that costing us having those exemptions? And then the second thing is, are we capturing now? Do you feel like now we're capturing most, if not all, of the online sales? And then the third question would be, how much of the actual tax credits are they costing us?
Okay, so starting with the question on sales tax, I will say that is a multi-part answer. Some of the exemptions are claimed at the point of purchase, so someone may claim an exemption that's a product-based exemption at the time they purchase it. Those items are not reported separately. So in terms of the fiscal impact on the state, that would be through either the fiscal note for the exemption that passed, or it would be in the Georgia State University's annual tax expenditure guide with their estimate of what it costs. So for example, someone had sent me a text that they wanted me to talk about Girl Scout cookies, which are amazingly tasty, so I don't want the Girl Scouts chasing me. But we don't track that. So when you go to the Girl Scout cookies or the Girl Scouts or other product-based exemptions at your local grocery store that are exempt, that's not reported separately on a return. So those are estimates there. There are some exemptions that have caps. For example, there have been caps placed on the zoo, aquarium, those types that have a certain amount to spend. And then there are others, such as the data centers, that have a reporting requirement for how much sales tax was saved by that particular entity. That's also reported. So very few of them are reported or captured separately because they all roll through a sales tax return like many other. So most of them are the result of fiscal estimates.
But I wouldn't even think about a Girl Scout, because I was thinking about just a pure sales tax report that says gross sales, and then the next line says like exempt sales.
Mm-hmm.
How much of those exempt sales are they in Georgia?
Yeah, I don't have that number. I could go back and find out what gross versus exempt sales are. I will tell you that some taxpayers report what I call a gross basis, where they put all their sales in, then exempt sales out, and then put taxable. And some taxpayers report their taxable sales with no exempt sales, and then it's the same number. It gets to the same number. So I could provide that number, but it probably would not be completely accurate number in terms of what's going through there and what the true exempt amount is. Because, for example, businesses may decide to report their sales for resale to other businesses that aren't subject to tax. They may decide to report that on the exempt sales line or not. So those are the kind of things that are in that line. So that may not give you exactly that piece of it.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
And then I think you had two other.
Use your mind.
Tax credits we've got, how much total dollar amount did all those tax credits amount to last year before last, whatever it is?
Yeah, we can, I don't have that with me. We can provide that number in terms of what the amounts are and then what the carry forwards are.
And the next question is, what about our online, gap in online sales tax? I know we're doing a lot better job at it, but we're doing a great job with it.
I would say we're doing a fantastic job. In fact, when the legislature passed the marketplace facilitators law in 2020, right when we were going into COVID, that was an amazing timing for that. So the facilitators are your Amazon, other folks where they have a marketplace and sellers go on there. Now the marketplace facilitator, a person running that site, remits the tax. So small sellers, it's great for them. They put their products up and, the Amazons of the world handle the tax collection there. So that picked up a lot of those kind of remote sellers and people we were after before that are much harder to chase for the small dollar sellers. So I think that picked up a ton of it. And in terms of dollars, we're running probably $61 to $63 million a month in state and local sales tax collections a month just on facilitators. We're doing a wonderful job. Other states, and we have some reporting to kind of narrow some of that to figure out making sure we're getting it and what we're doing, and our numbers are fantastic. They're better than a lot of other states because I've seen other states' numbers and they're nowhere near ours.
Well, that'll have to close us out. I don't think we have any more questions. Thank you, Commissioner, members of the department, and all our presenters today. I see several of them are still here. Both our economists, Dr. Dorfman, Dr. Bushman, the members. Just the chairman reminded me to tell you that we, in the next few days, will be getting out the rest of the year's schedule on our meetings, and the next one of which will be sometime in August. We're going to take July off with everybody traveling and on vacation. If nobody has anything else for the good of the order, we'll adjourn. Thank you again.